Yes.
too. You've got a difficult job, haven't you?
I've got the easiest one.
Oh, you've got the easiest one.
It's your intellectual brain power that. Oh, hello, Adrian.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Nicola.
Good to meet you.
Sorry for not answering your mail, but I have been having some problems with my email server, so my emails didn't get out. But your presentation
not to worry,
will be fine.
It's all fine.
That's not an issue.
Hello, Magdalena.
She's gone away.
All right.
Looks nice, no?
That looks like it's us.
Yeah. I think it's all been going really well. I'm really impressed by some of the contributions. It's excellent.
So am I must say, Maria. It's a great
Thank you.
success.
Thank you. Yeah, we are very happy with all those positive feedback, and also ourselves with the conference. We are very happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's nothing.
I should say that I can take no credit whatsoever for this, because this was long planned before my arrival. So I'm not being self-congratulatory. It's a genuine congratulation to the colleagues that have worked on this.
Yeah.
Okay, I will look on this. So whom are we waiting? So we have
Paulo.
for Nadia and Paulo and Magdalena.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of more minutes. I mean, we have quite some time, so.
Okay, but it's all working. I might just go and get a quick coffee.
Yeah, sure.
And come back in 5. Yeah. If that's okay.
Me too.
Excellent. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Adrian. See you soon.
I haven't seen the plan yet, but that shows lunch break.
It says there's 5 participants, but there's only 4 on my thing.
Yeah, but we are starting at 1:30, so it's normal that people are not here yet.
Yeah, no, but I say it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, okay. Strange.
You haven't finished it. Have I not finished it?
Oh no, that's me.
We want to finish it. You need to. That's good. Thank you.
So you've got my presentations okay, Maria?
Yes, I do.
Great. I'll just say next slide, yeah?
Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem. Oh, there's Nadia.
Hey, good afternoon.
Hello, nice to see you. Everything all right?
I think so.
Nadia, do you hear me? How shall we go about with the PowerPoint presentation? Do you?
Well, I mean, I will open it and I will click the mouse.
Okay, so you will continue clicking on it while I present. Okay.
Yeah, because it doesn't work that you click when I share the presentation. The one who shares it has to click.
Okay. Okay, great.
The worst of the cases, if anything goes wrong, Maria has our slides as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome, Magdalena.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
I think we are complete now. Nadia, Adrienne.
A quick question, are we the ones responsible for our own presentation so we can share the PowerPoints?
Yes. You can also send it to me if you want me to have it as well, so that if something happens, I can share it. But if you want to do it and you know how to do it, then go ahead. I don't need to do it, but just I can if you want.
I sent my presentation to Nicola. I don't have your email, I think.
Yeah, he can send it to me, but I think it will be okay. If you want to test it now, we can do it. We are still not.
Oh no, I need to have your approval. Someone is, because you are sharing the.
Do you want me to stop? Then I will stop.
Yeah, it's just to check if I can open it quickly.
Sure.
So it should be. And it works, right?
Yes, it works.
Okay, good.
Great.
And I can pass. That's fine. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, we have 5 minutes, so.
Does everybody have copies of all the articles in the EGR special issue? Because if you haven't, just ask me, because I've kind of got, because when you go into the, well, particularly for people from outside, they have to, it's not, doesn't seem to be directly accessible. I suppose it is for academics. But if anybody wants all the copies, then just ask me.
Thank you.
I think Dean's going to be in another session at the same time as this one.
Yes. Yes, he has been moved to panel 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they were lacking a speaker and he fitted there too, so.
Mm-hmm. Oh, lovely. Four.
Hello, Paolo.
Hello Nicola,
Piacere di conoscerti.
piacere mio.
Thank you.
So Nicola, just to remind you, the participants can put their questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, because the chat is disabled for participants. Everything should go to the Q&A, comments and questions.
The quick question, how are we raising our hands here if we need to in this version of the Zoom?
Here you can't raise your hand in webinars. You can, yeah.
So just like this if necessary.
Yeah.
Magdalena, I'll be keeping an eye on panelists in particular. So of course, feel free to intervene, but if you raise your hand, I'll immediately pass you the mic. Okay.
Okay, it's just to
Yes.
know.
It's strange because although we have a big audience, it's actually four of us speaking to each other. So I think I have good visuals of you all.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it is in webinars you see actually the speakers, you see them all. In a meeting, sometimes you have to scroll their different pages and you can see.
Right now on my screen, I have everyone. So if you raise your hand.
I think we can start. There already.
Excellent.
There are already some attendees, and I'm sure they will be coming. And it's time, I think. No.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
Good afternoon all. I'm sure you will agree that this has been a most exciting and intellectually stimulating day and a half, and I can reassure you that the speakers in this panel and the panel as a whole will make a key contribution to the conference and of course to our understanding in particular of the ways in which trade unions are currently approaching the issue, the realities of climate change. I am Nicola Kouduris. I am the Director of Research here at the ETUI, and I have the pleasure of moderating panel 4 in today's conference. Panel 4 deals with trade unions and climate change. As part of my duties, I have also the pleasure of introducing our speakers and commentator in this panel. The first speaker, I will present the speakers in their order of appearance, is Professor Linda Clark, who will be introducing the panel. I'm just introducing the panelists. And she will also be a presenter. She will present on her paper, Trade Union Strategies on Climate Change Mitigation between Opposition, Hedging, and Support. Linda is a professor of European Industrial Relations and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Reproduction of the Built Environment at the University of Westminster. Among the other things, she has co-edited, together with Professor Carla Lipsig-Mami of York University in Canada, the current special issue of the European Journal of Industrial Relations on trade unions, climate change, and just transitions, on which this very panel is based. Linda is also associate director of the large Canadian research project on climate change and work, led by her colleague Carla Lipsig-Mami, which has many partners, including the Canadian Labour Congress and us, the ETUI. In their order of appearance, the second set of speakers will be Nadia Dörflinger and Adrian Thomas, presented their co-authored work on trade union strategies on climate change mitigation between opposition, hedging, and support. Nadia is a junior research group leader at the Federal Institute for Occupational Health and Safety in Germany. Her group mainly conducts research on frontline service work. She has conducted also research on labor markets, employment relations, and trade unions in Europe, a typical work, labor market flexibility, and of course, the forthcoming changes in the world of work as arising from climate change, and the way in which social actors will deal with these changes are now her key area of interest and main preoccupational work. Adrian is a research scientist at LISA, the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research, which he joined a decade ago in 2009 after studying Sciences Po and receiving a doctorate in political science from the Sorbonne in 2008. His research interests focus on collective bargaining, the sociology of trade unions, and labor environmentalism. He has published, among others, in the Journal for Common Market Studies, the British Journal of Industrial Relations, and the European Journal of Industrial Relations. Paolo Tomasetti, who will be presenting his paper From Dead Mill of Production to Just Transitions and Beyond, is an assistant professor at the University of Bergamo in Italy, where he teaches labor law and trade union law. His research focuses on how to make labor law more responsive to contemporary societal needs, including those arising from climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy. He is the author of several publications, amongst the most recent, Diritto del Lavoro e Ambiente, published in 2018 by Adapt University Press, and also a number of English and Italian language publications on the linkages between labor law and climate change. Last but not least, we have our comrade Magdalena Sikorska, who will be acting as our discussant and commentator. Magdalena is a policy officer at the European Federation of Building and Woodworkers. She's also a member of the Federation Secretariat, and her responsibilities within the organization are rich, vast, and extremely topical. They cover policy areas such as a European social dialogue, gender equality, the recovery strategy, the future of work, and of course, the European Green Deal and climate change. It's a real privilege to be the moderator of this panel. I will pass the virtual microphone to Linda Clark for her brief introduction of the panel itself.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Nicola. I should say that my contribution later on is actually going to be about the construction industry and not the title you gave, but I'll just start. Next slide. Can you please? Maria is doing my slides. Yes, as Nicholas said, the panel is based on the special issue of the European Journal of Industrial Relations, edited by Guillermo Merdi and Richard Hyman. And the special issue is on trade unions, climate change and just transition. And it's co-edited with Carla. Carla leads the big Canadian project on climate change and work, which has been going on for 12 years. And I put the link up here because as well as the large number of partners, it also has some useful databases for trade unions, including on training programs and on collective bargaining clauses, as well as on trade union initiatives. And it's a program that's focused on highlighting the special role that unions play in climate change, because after all, 80% of CO2 emissions arise in production. And there's a lot of focus, of course, on particularly on the top 15 polluting industries, which account for 12% of EU employment and 24 million workers. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, when I think about and read all about the different just transition strategies and talk to trade unionists, it reminds me enormously of the transition debate, which originally as a historian is a particularly important debate which started just after the war, following Maurice Dobbs' studies in the development of capitalism. Now, this was a debate which was not just about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, but it revolved around the drivers, whether that was capital accumulation and growth, class struggle, role of state, technological development, trade, or the market. And hearing the debates over the last couple of days, as very much this echoed in this original debate on the transition. And the question it raises, of course, is what about the labor and what about the labor process as movers? And I think that's what we're particularly concerned with. When we look at the interpretations, which are very different, of just transition, they range from calls for decent jobs and employment rights with the union role confined to what is possible within existing power relations, to challenging property relations and green growth, expanding public ownership and participatory democracy, which is, for instance, echoed in the trade unions for energy democracy, their different initiatives, challenging the growth model and socio and economic relations which caused climate change in the first place. Next slide, please. And our research has very much highlighted the dichotomies that unions face in terms of jobs versus the environment, in terms of their traditional role, or how far they can be environmental actors, in terms of just focusing on a technological fix or on wider social solutions, and above all, how unions can become subjects rather than just objects of history. And it's apparent from our research, certainly, that the very deep changes are needed in the social relations of production and in the labor process, how goods and services are provided and transported, how the built environment's constructed and used, and above all, how workers and young people are educated and trained. And this still remains an area which is really rather neglected. Next slide, please. So I'll just finish by saying that what we identify and what you'll hear in the contributions that follow are very different strategies that are adopted by unions, whether they're more positive, supportive of climate change measures, which are particularly apparent in sectors that are important to the realization of the green economy, such as electronics and construction, and which might even embrace a transformative vision, to strategies that are more mixed, when the industry is subject to major change to reduce environmental impact, such as automobiles and steel, and even oppositional when faced with being phased out, such as very evident with coal. But of course, any strategy depends on union strength, sectors covered and their importance for being implemented. And above all, any transformation hinges on the active involvement of labour and unions and state intervention, and not on technological innovation, trade and the market. Of course, those remain important. what we see is often too much focus just on quantitative issues rather than more qualitative issues related to, as I've said, vocational education. And what is particularly important is to understand just what just transition means in practice. And I hope we'll give some idea of that in the following. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda, and apologies for the mistake. The presentation that you will give us is on your paper, Unions and the Green Transitions in Europe, Contrasting Visions. Thanks for this introduction. And Nadia and Adrian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that you can see my slides. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. In the next couple of minutes, Adrian and I would like to present the research that we did. It is a research in which we looked at trade union strategies towards climate change mitigation, so really concrete strategies. This is arguably a topic that challenges trade unions as they need to find ways on how to deal with the possibly emerging dilemmas, or how Linda called it, dichotomies, particularly the ones between jobs versus the environment. Climate change mitigation is a very complex topic for unions and social actors in general, because it does not only involve the parties at the bargaining table, which means the unions and the employers, but also society. And even though society is not represented at the bargaining table, it may be greatly affected by the outcomes of the negotiations between unions and employers. And this makes the whole topic even more challenging. So what did we do in detail? In our research, we've particularly focused on the question on how European trade unions come to terms with policies focused on reducing emissions. We look particularly at two sectors, the power generation sector and manufacturing, because these are two sectors that are particularly targeted by climate change mitigation policies and already existing regulations. And our aim was to develop a kind of typology, because we expected a large diversity in trade union strategies towards climate change mitigation. And in order to do so, we analyzed a large range of pre-selected trade union strategies on decarbonization policies along three dimensions. First, unions' positions regarding the scientific consensus towards climate change. Second, strategies towards climate change mitigation. And the third one was attitudes concerning employment transitions. We did not limit our data collection to certain EU member states. In contrast, we really analyzed a very wide range of union strategies, because we really wanted to obtain very different examples of trade union approaches and strategies. We collected those strategies mainly through document analysis, but we also interviewed 28 experts of trade unions and employer associations at different levels, and we also interviewed policymakers. The main challenge here was to identify examples of trade union strategies that basically go beyond rhetorics or very general political statements. We really wanted to find examples reflecting an actual engagement with specific climate policies, for instance, something like the EU emissions trading system or carbon taxation. So based on our work, we could identify a kind of typology, but the typology is actually more a continuum along three ideal typical types of strategies: opposition, hedging, and support. Strategies opposing climate change, so on the left side, they really see unions openly rejecting the adoption of emission reducing policies. To the best of our knowledge, there is only one example of such outright opposition to climate change mitigation, and this is the Polish coal miners' unions. They have consistently opposed EU climate policies, and they demand still a continued strong reliance of Poland on coal-based power generation. So in general, what we see here is a mix of job preservation concerns and arguments about national energy sovereignty. If we go to the other extreme of the continuum, those are the support strategies that can be found there. Support strategies are basically adopted by unions supporting mitigation policies, and also unions with a very proactive instead of reactive approach towards decarbonization. One example of such a strategy is the so-called Just Energy Transition Statement, which was signed in 2017 by the participants of the European Social dialogue in the energy sector. The statement provides a lot of recommendations in terms of how this just transition could look like. It also has recommendations regarding company policies, regarding skills development, reskilling, job creation, and it also calls for additional public financing of the transition. And even though the statement is a very nice example of a support strategy, it needs to be mentioned that it is not legally binding. So there is still a possibility that the agreement will not generate any results in practice. But it still represents a nice example of a commitment by unions to support decarbonization, and it certainly reflects a proactive approach with all of its employment implications. Hedging strategies, so those somewhere in between opposition and support, are the most frequent ones to date. They are adopted by unions that do not deny the need to mitigate climate change, but they seek to minimize regulation, they advocate incremental approaches, and they really underline the competing priorities between employment and the environment. So those unions adopting hedging strategies, they are sometimes a bit reluctant to really engage proactively with the transition-related employment implications. And also here, let me quickly provide an example. One example is the position of the steelworkers unions over the latest reform of the EU ETS, so the emissions trading system, in February 2018. There was a debate, and basically industry all stated in the debate that the climate policy goals of ETS, they were overly ambitious, and they really demanded also a greater allocation of free allowances. And while they still underlined that, of course, there is a need for decarbonization, it was quite clear that industry all also wanted to buy time in order to go for these incremental approaches. So therefore, hedging strategies, they really aim at shaping regulations without directly opposing the need for climate change mitigations. And after we've identified those ideal typical strategies, we of course also wanted to explain the factors or the conditions shaping them. And Adrian will now tell you a little more about that.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. So what explains these positions? What factors shape the positions of unions towards climate change mitigation policies? We have found a first and determining factor to be sectoral interests. And this is related to the fact that unions are membership organizations and that one of their key goals is to represent their members' interests. That is, mainly maintaining jobs and decent working conditions. And this priority given to membership's immediate interests, the membership's immediate job preservation interests, reflects in the prevalence of hedging strategies, because at the current moment in time, the most frequent approach that we have seen by trade unions towards decarbonization policies are hedging policies. Hedging policies, that means that while trade unions accept in principle the need for decarbonization, they seek to minimize regulation, they advocate incremental approaches to gain time and tackle the social aspects of decarbonization. But we have also seen during our analysis that sectoral interests and membership logics are not the only factors affecting the trade union policies towards climate change. And here it's useful to refer to the typology of trade union identities that has been elaborated by British Labour sociologist Richard Hyman. And Richard defined three models of trade unionism in Europe: unions as market bargainers, unions as mobilizers of class opposition, and unions as partners in social integration. And in our article, we give a number of concrete examples to illustrate these tendencies. But with regards to climate change mitigation policies, one sees that hedging and opposition strategies towards climate mitigation policies can be mostly expected from market-oriented unions, which strictly focus on the interests, on the immediate interests of their membership, without much regard for the interests of other groups of workers working in low carbon activities, for instance, or groups of workers working in the green economy. market-oriented unions can also be expected to enter into lobbying coalitions with employers and with companies to advocate for less ambitious climate policies, because there is a perceived common interest in minimizing regulation in order not to endanger profitable industries. On the other hand, we have seen that unions that are more society-oriented, which come more from a background where they see themselves as partners in social integration, these unions can be expected to integrate broader societal concerns into their decision-making processes, so they do not just focus on the immediate job interests of the membership, but they also take into account the needs of future generations or future workers, who might be at the present time still non-organized, and so take a broader approach. And then a last dimension, a last factor shaping union attitudes towards climate mitigation strategies is union democracy. And different understandings of union democracy can be expected to affect unions' climate strategies. Climate policies are a different policy issue for unions because they need to balance the defense of sectoral and short-term interests with general and long-term interests. And this may involve, in a number of instances, choices between the interests of different member groups. For instance, between members active in low carbon activities and members active in more carbon intensive activities. And here one can expect that bureaucratic decision-making in processes in unions may tend to favor entrenched interests within unions, whereas more participatory decision-making mechanisms may favor the consideration of the interests of all workers, including non-unionized workers. So how can trade unions build up a long-term strategy on climate change and decarbonization? We think that trade unions should also consider the opportunity climate change and climate change mitigation offers to unions to present themselves as responsible actors that take a proactive attitude towards the low carbon transition. This proactive attitude can raise public awareness of the broader role that unions play in society and might contribute moving them away from a perception as a mere special interest group. Such a proactive attitude may also help unions in gaining new members, for instance, in the emerging green economy. And trade unions could also build links with environmental NGOs or environmental social movements like the Fridays for Future movement, and thus increase their capacity to address the complex policy issues involved in climate change. However, there is, of course, also the danger for unions that established member groups that are negatively affected by decarbonization might turn away from unions. This then confronts trade unions with difficulties, especially in a context where trade unions in many countries are confronted with the decline of their traditional strongholds in manufacturing industry, and are also confronted with the parallel rise of mostly non-unionized jobs in the service sector. And so I think one of our conclusions is that unions depend on support by public policies that further the low carbon transition, but address at the same time the legitimate demands of workers for economic security. And in this context, public support for just transition policies would probably make it easier for unions to strike a balance between employment and climate concerns.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you very much, Nadia. It was extremely clear and extremely insightful. Could I ask our next speaker, Paolo Tomasetti, to start his presentation? And I should say to the numerous members of the public that are following us at the moment that if you want to ask some questions for the Q&A session that will take place towards the end of this panel, I would be grateful if you could use the Q&A facility as opposed to the chat facility. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paolo. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. I will present my paper, whose title is From Treadmill of Production to Just Transition and Beyond. Can you hear me? Yes? Can you see the slide? Yes, great. So in this paper, I actually analyzed two theoretical frameworks. One is the treadmill of production theory, and the other one is the just transition. I contrast them, and I try to look at their intersections, similarities, differences, and I try also to analyze the spaces of overlapping between these two theories. And afterwards, I will apply this theoretical framework to the Italian case, and the Italian case in the paper is contrasted with broader trends. But today I don't have time to go into the comparative insights of my research. And I will also leave behind all the methodological aspects related to my research. I just want to mention that the research I conducted and I presented in this paper was conducted through an EU research project co-funded by the European Commission. The research project is named Agreement, a Green Mentality for Collective Bargaining, and it explores the role of industrial relations institutions in deconstructing the alternative between labor and environment through collective bargaining and such dialogue. So I will start to briefly frame the theory of treadmill of production, which was elaborated by Alois Nyberg in 1980s. The main narrative behind this theory is that Western capitalism runs on a treadmill. In this treadmill, the more resources for economic development, production, and growth and consumption are restricted, the more environmental degradation worsens. But the environmental effects of treadmill of production are not the only one effects that follows this system of treadmill, because also economic development becomes more difficult if finite resources are completely exploited without any rationality. So the treadmill of production theory actually tries to keep balanced the three dimensions of sustainability, of what nowadays we call sustainable development, the dimension, the pillar of economic sustainability, the pillar of social sustainability, and the one on environmental sustainability. And what's the role of industrial relations in treadmill of production? Well, according to Nyberg, industrial relations are a product of industrial capitalism, and therefore unions and collective bargaining contributed actually to speeding up the treadmill of production, with the aim of increasing the share of resources redistributed from capital to labor. Unions in Western jurisdictions embrace the capitalistic mantra of growth. And here, the problem of collective action arises since the goal, the ambition, the objective of trade unions are mainly the defense of jobs and the increasing of working conditions and decent work. And behind these goals, there is actually an economic interest, which is meant to be incompatible with the environmental interest. And therefore, industrial relations institutions are in the condition, not in the condition to deconstruct the alternative between labor and environment. So if we look at the treadmill of production theory, we can frame this theoretical framework as the underpinning model of the post-World War II social contract, under which government, labor, and capital all together contributed to fuel the spiral of production, consumption, and environmental degradation. So if we look at the just transition model, which is the opposite model of treadmill of production, and the transition towards a greener economy, towards a low carbon economy is the completely different model that leaves behind the treadmill of production way of functioning. The system of increasing growth production at the expenses of the environment. So if we look at the goals of transition to a lower carbon economy, we know what leaves behind, which is the treadmill of production system. Just transition theory is completely different, as I said, and the main narrative here is that unions can play a key role in fostering a socially fair transition away from carbon and other polluting industry. Of course, just transitions has different implications in different contexts according to different also way of defining what is justice behind the transition to a low carbon economy. But the overall assumption is that unions can mitigate the social effects of the transition to a low carbon economy, and industrial relations especially stands out as a potential channel of integration and convergence between labor and environmental sustainability. Well, the main argument behind my paper is that between these two different theoretical frameworks, there is a continuity, and there are lots of spaces of integration. There are pieces of just transition within the treadmill of production theory, and there are important segments, still important segments of treadmill of production theory within the just transition. And there are lots of room for intersection between these two theoretical frameworks, and Italian case really very well fits within the intersection between these two theoretical frameworks. And actually in my paper, I try to explain why from the lenses of the evolution of industrial relations in Italy, historical evolution of industrial relations in Italy since World War II. It's the unit of analysis I take in my research. These two theoretical frameworks can be deconstructed, and I will give you few insights from the main findings of my article. From the historical point of view, despite treadmill of production being the dominant logic of collective action during much of the modern industrial era in Italy, a long but weak wave of just transition can be identified from the late 60s as Italian union struggles for decent and healthier working environments contributed to making production processes more sustainable for the broader environment and the community far beyond the workplace. Yeah, and this long way of just transition is nowadays reinforced and made more visible by an explicit integration of labor and environmental protection through collective bargaining and social partnership. So basically my argument in this part of the paper is that union struggles of late 60s and early 70s in Italy and also elsewhere in other countries where unions can be framed as a social movement in contrast to the business union model of trade unionism. So in these countries, in Italy in particular, these movements and struggles of late 60s and early 70s were pioneering examples of just transition. So I frame this phase of the historical evolution of industrial relations, but more broadly, the industrial society in Italy and elsewhere as pioneering examples of just transition. And we come to the situation, the current situation, where we find, the current situation, to simplify, we can define it as the just transition era, right? So we leave the treadmill of production era and we go into the just transition era, where we find many examples of such dialogue and policy initiatives with clear commitments to the just transition, how to achieve it, and how to make labor and environmental sustainability convergent. But actually, also if we look into the collective bargaining system at both national level, sectoral level, but also collective bargaining at the firm level, we find many examples of collective agreements dealing with environmental issues, introducing green clauses that also Linda mentioned before from the Canadian project. I collected the number of collective bargaining measures in this list, but I want also to stress, to underline that this is a sort of wish list. Not in all collective agreements we find this set of measures dealing with environmental aspects. These can be found just in a few collective agreements. A few of them are can be observed in groups of collective agreements, but not in others. So this is not a wish list. This is just a sample, an example of collective bargaining measures that we can observe in collective agreements. And these measures can be grouped into three large categories. The first one is groups the kind of measures related to participation and involvement of workers' representative in environmental decisions at different level, in different contexts. For example, within the prevention system of occupational health and safety. Then we have clauses regulating the labor market implication of the transition to the green economy, to a low carbon economy. And then we have more traditional clauses, like more confrontational driven clauses, for example, negotiation of green clauses in subcontracting, or negotiation of pay rises linked to green targets such as energy efficiency and conservation, environmental whistleblowing procedures negotiated by social partners at sectoral level, and the supporting for workers' refusal to execute orders and directives potentially harmful for the environment are the examples of more conflict-oriented kind of measures that we can find in collective bargaining in Italy. But unfortunately, not all that glitters is gold. Indeed, if we look at the concrete results of the research in this part related to the just transition era, we see that there is still a large gap between words and deeds. Central policies on just transition and sustainable development do not necessarily translate into coherent actions at the local level. There are a number of best practices, but they are still limited in terms of coverage. We estimated a 5% of collective agreement coverage of collective agreements that actually refers to environmental sustainability or regulate aspects linked to environmental sustainability. And these best practices are sectional and very hard to generalize. And furthermore, very good example coexist with very bad practices. So while everyone agrees on the need for a just transition, everyone in Italy, such partners, trade unions, employers associations, the government, nobody argue in favor of unjust transition, but the idea of justice on the ground is still open to debate and conflict. And in many cases, labor and capital interests still prevail over environmental ones, and new dimensions of treadmill of production emerge in the just transition era. So in conclusion, unions seem to be part of the problem and part of the solution. And this reflects the broader contradiction of capitalism. Success of transitionary processes depends on available resources, including public and private investment and a certain degree of development. And this is actually a problem for Italy because we have very different geographical imbalances and differences of development of different regions, different sectors. When it comes to Italy, we have to talk plural. We are a country with a lot of internal contradiction and different patterns of development in different areas, in different sectors, and different types of companies. Indeed, if we have very good just transition practices like the Enel case or other cases in the electricity sector, we also have very bad experiences of transition to a low carbon economy with big social consequences and also environmental consequences. And these cases of unjust transition tend to take place in depressed areas and sectors with low added value and growth capacity where monopsonist labor markets.
Paolo, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was outstanding. Thank you for your extremely enlightening presentation. And can I pass the virtual microphone to Linda for her presentation on, I repeat the title, I hope I get it right, Unions and the Green Transition in Europe, Contrasting Visions. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, Maria's going to put this up for me and turn the slides for me. Is that okay, Maria?
Yes, I'm just waiting for Paolo to, yeah, he stopped sharing.
Oh, okay.
I'll do this right away.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about the construction industry, which I've worked on for many years, and how the transition is shaping up in the industry. You can see on this first slide, and I'll point out these two pictures are quite interesting because they're taken from the Italian training center, which we visited, and where the trainees were learning about solar panel installation and had been for many years, and about the use of hemp and lime as alternative building materials. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Construction's a really happy story, isn't it? Because this is all set for growth. And this is statistics from the ILO calculating the number of jobs, and it's a sector, of course, which is going to gain more than any other, or set to. Next slide, please. And of course, it's got an enormous job, because this picture will give you a picture of the hard to heat dwellings across Europe. Many of those living in them suffering from fuel poverty. So this is a great job, particularly for retrofit. Next slide, please. And the European Union has been making efforts to address climate change in the sector, or carbon emissions, which are set to be reduced by 32.5% by 2030. The main construction is itself responsible for 40% of EU CO2 end-use emissions. So this is a really big task that the sector faces. And this is largely at European level been seen to be enacted through the European Performance in Buildings Directive, which sets energy efficient technical targets through airtight building envelopes and on-site renewables in order to try and achieve nearly zero energy building for all new buildings, that is. And, and of course, next to that is envisaged retrofit programs. So you'll see the European Commission approach is really rather technical rather than social, although that said, there has been quite an effort to look at what's needed in terms of training the construction workforce through an initiative which was called Build Up Skills, which identified barriers to meeting new energy efficient requirements. Next slide, please. And actually, the barriers are just phenomenal. The industry is facing the need for a major transformation, not only in terms of knowledge and know-how, which is generally not in vocational education programs, in transforming, developing occupational capacity so that workers understand the overall project, have a degree of energy literacy, and are able to work with other occupations and understand what they're doing. And that means, of course, integrated team working, and that in turn implies regulating any subcontract chain and depends really on direct employment. At the same time, it's going to be critical to overcome the divide that exists at the moment between professionals and the workforce. And really, it depends, this transformation, on labour as the agent of production. It's key to transforming the labour process is to include workers, trade unionists and educationists in the transition. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk a bit about the research. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. The research we undertook, which was under the umbrella of the Canadian project, which was together with my colleague Melahat Sahin Dickman and my late colleague Colin Gleeson. And we concentrated particularly on 4 countries, Denmark, Germany, Italy, and UK. Well, in UK, particularly on Scotland. Of course, these have very different workforce sizes in terms of construction, over 2 million workers each in Germany and UK, Italy rather less, and Denmark, of course, really rather small, 0.3 million, and each country having very different models of industrial relations and vocational education. So we set to evaluate the role of labour in the transition to green construction through examining union initiatives, which meant reviewing union proposals, interviewing unions, and also training centres, and also visiting sites and talking to people on sites. Next slide, thank you. Now, I've already said the constraints on the transition are enormous, and there's very different approaches taken, some much more successful than others, with a much more qualified overall workforce in Germany and Denmark, and much lower levels of qualification to be found in Italy and UK. And at the same time, very different models of vocational education, much more college-based and workshop-based in countries like Denmark and Germany than in the much more work-based, employer-based systems in Italy and UK. And I think what's particularly important is the very different approaches to developing the workforce, to labour itself. And at one extreme, we can see a very tailorist type approach, training for particular skills, relying on heavy supervision, and really seeing labour as a commodity. And I'm afraid we see that all too often in UK. And at the other extreme, really aimed at developing labour potential and capacity, the ability of workers to take responsibility for the work undertaken, a much more valued view of labour, really. And this is reflected in the approaches to vocational education for low energy construction. On the one hand, depending on rather short courses, much more short-term perspective, and on the other hand, mainstreaming energy literacy into every single construction occupation, much more long-term vision. Next slide, please. But the industry really, no, sorry, can you go back? Labour market constraints. The industry really faces the most difficult task because of the labour market itself, which is not conducive at all to low energy construction. It's dominated by smaller micro firms consisting of 95 to 98% of firms in construction. Only Germany has rather more medium-sized firms. And the larger firms really don't often employ anybody, employ the workforce itself, I mean. Self-employment, particularly in Italy and UK, is almost half the workforce. It's often called bogus self-employment, much less, of course, in Denmark and Germany. And this has meant, this very fragmented structure has meant a decline in training provision, I think almost everywhere, because there's a very weak training infrastructure and generally what's called employer disengagement, and resulting in severe skill shortages, a reliance on migrant workforce, an aging male-dominated workforce, and the effect really is to reinforce what's called the performance gap, that is between the energy efficient standards set and those that are actually achieved. Thank you. Next one. Now we framed academics love typologies, and so ours has been this threefold typology, which was really developed by Paul Hampton in his book on unions and climate change, between market-based pathways to a low carbon economy based on market forces, bit of state regulation, training on demand. What the predominant approach of the unions, which is ecological modernization, state-led, assuming a proactive investment by private companies, retraining of workers, really very much how the whole just transition approach is situated there. And finally, a radical transformation, which I'm trying to indicate is going to be necessary in the construction industry, where the interests of labor and the environment are intertwined, a labor-centered narrative. Next slide, please. And to give you now these examples from the unions that we looked at in Denmark, Germany, and UK, that's Unite, 3F, and IG Bau, the strategies are really rather similar. Generally, apart from UK, built on social partnership, aimed at reducing energy consumption and CO2 emissions in buildings, increasing renewable energy and extending district heating networks, extending the recycling market by including roads and insulation, improving vocational education and training, and developing a more holistic and collaborative approach, plus retrofitting the existing housing stock. But generally, the unions themselves, there's few union officials actually involved in this, and the priority is still given to collective bargaining, jobs, employee rights, health and safety, of course, and a rather low awareness amongst the membership. Next slide. Now, this is where things get interesting. Filia, CGL. Now, this really follows well from Paolo's presentation, because a very different approach is evident from Filia, CGL in Italy, which has 150,000 members. Now, they produced a strategy in 2014, which, to quote, is an end to the building of new homes, zero soil consumption, and a reduction in building on greenfield sites. They're aiming to reduce use of cement by 50%, to be replaced by low emission and environmentally friendly materials like hemp and lime, to protect the environment from the spread of concrete-based building construction and unnecessary urbanization, and to take advantage of procurement processes. Now, of course, they're also involved in the trade unions for energy democracy, and also in another very interesting European project to promote social dialogue on green construction. I won't go into the details of that, but it's worth looking at. Next slide, please. And another example, which we found on the ground so I think we need to look really closer to the ground to see more interesting alternatives, which in this case is the employment model used by Glasgow City Building, which is a coalition really of the local authority, a housing association, and the Joint Trade Union Council that employs directly 2,200 people, regulates its contract chain, has a manufacturing arm with the majority of people with disabilities, highly unionized, large-scale training workshops, producing social housing, green social housing, using local materials, and repairing and maintaining and retrofitting all of Glasgow City Building stock. It's built on a not-for-profit ethos, and of course, a historically strong trade union involvement. Next slide, please. So just to draw to a conclusion, the challenges, of course, are weak unions, weak vocational education systems, a fragmented construction labor process, But the implications of what we've been looking at are really that the nearly zero energy building is incompatible with a fragmented Taylorist approach. It's critical to develop labour and training. Next slide, please. And the implications are that we should be looking not just at job creation and green jobs, but at a chance to transform, improve the employment and working conditions in the construction industry, that decent work is a necessity for carbon reduction. It's not just about skills development, but about knowledge and competencies and upgrading vocational education programs, energy literacy for the entire workforce, the need for greater involvement of unions, and above all, the need for inclusivity, recruiting all those excluded, including women, if wide-scale retrofit programs are to be accomplished. And I'll just finish with this last slide, next slide, which is taken from what I call it a manifesto of the Filia CGL. There is such a level of overbuilding in Italy, it is not even possible to distinguish between different areas. Cities are increasingly encroaching surrounding areas, overflowing with unbroken lines of industrial warehouses. That is exactly why we need a new urban strategy, drastically reducing the consumption of land and use of cement with the aid of tools and interventions agreed upon and shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was extremely insightful, especially the case studies. I found them extremely interesting. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, and there is a question from Jackie Simpkins. Is this being recorded? I should have said this. It is being recorded, and it will be made available for the wider public to view later, and the same goes for the other panels that are taking place simultaneously at the moment. Thank you. And our next speaker, indeed, our next commentator and discussant is Magdalena from the European Federation of Building and Woodworkers. We just concluded Linda's presentation with a statement from an affiliated Italian organization, Filea. So it's a great way of passing the microphone to Magdalena for her comments. Thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you very much. As well, I have prepared a little presentation. I would like to say it will be a bit of a challenge speaking after Professor Clark, because we do as well, I cover construction and wood sector. So I will try to don't repeat the same information, but well, it's a bit difficult to kind of work on the presentation in the meantime when you have another presentation. So I will try to focus on some features that hasn't been introduced. So EFBWW is a European Federation of Construction and Woodworkers, and we represent around 75 national trade union federations from 34 countries with around 2 million members. And as I said, we cover building materials, wood, furniture, and building materials, as I said. Today, I would like to focus more on the construction industry. So as you have already learned, construction industry is quite unique, complex. It involves a variety of different stakeholders, agencies, subcontractors, contractors. It's labor, it's ad hoc labor, mainly relating on seasonal workers or migrant workers. There are variety of different safety hazards. I don't know if you know, but at the construction sites, where the project site, it's quite accident prone, and the accident rate at the construction industry is 4 times higher than any other industry. So there are lots of safety hazards and labor quality, as it has already been mentioned. Well, there's a huge scarcity of skilled manpower. When it comes to construction and environment, as this had been already mentioned previously, it accounts for around 80 million direct jobs in the EU. It represents around 9% of EU GDP. And buildings contribute to around 40% of total energy consumption, and they're responsible for around 25 greenhouse gas emissions. Where we see huge opportunity wasn't presented by the European Commission European Green Deal that actually made a big policy shift within the unions to look for climate aspects. European Green Deal acknowledged the proactive reskilling and upskilling, as well. There is huge discussion about energy efficiency standards, carbon pricing, and border adjustment mechanism. As well, the role of circular economy and just transition mechanism has been emphasized, but what we don't see is that even if the social dialogue has been mentioned in one or other way, we still don't see the specific recognition of the role of the unions and the ways it could play, for example, in the just transition. And what we have noticed from our different members, that there is a general support of the Paris Agreement and as well the call for the just transition. But unfortunately, there is huge lack of resources. What I mean is that different unions don't only lack of particular personnel who would look after climate issues, but as well the expertise. There is no such expertise, or if there is one, maybe one member is responsible for several dossiers, for example, international secretary. Among them, they take care of climate issues, but there are no dedicated personnel who would really take time and develop those policies. So I would say that there's still more the tendency to kind of look at the traditional membership issues which are related to employment. And as you know, there is a declining membership across the EU countries, and there is still quite big low awareness of workers about professional progress. They don't see that actually they could develop professionally with the upcoming different green jobs, and like in energy efficiency, circular economy, digitalization. And on the top of that, the transposition of different EU legislations like EED, EBBD, or NZB, they were not really, it was quite low when it comes to the national building regulations. So where we see possible solutions, and as you have heard, the renovation wave strategy has been introduced last year and promises around 160,000 new green jobs in the industry. This is really great. We are happy about that, but we lack skilled workers, and we need, of course, the training and upskilling to address this challenge. So if we have the workers with the right skills, we could attract more workers to the sector, because the construction sector is not the most attractive sector, I must say. And we hope that with a new type of works, we could get more members and more workers, especially the female and young people. And of course, creating new jobs would create quality jobs and good salaries, respecting work-life balance. As well, there's a huge need to integrate migrant and mobile workers in a sustainable manner, because it's not that we only lack workforce, but we lack skilled workers, and many workers, they lack of basic training. So if you don't have a basic training, how are you supposed to perform, if I may say, those fancy jobs in energy efficiency? You first need to have the basic skills to be able to gain further skills. So there is a huge focus right now on the PACS 4 skills, and it's fit for the future. By the way, we are one of the partners of the project, the Blueprint for Construction, which is currently run by, just financed by the European Commission. And when there is a huge political pressure to deliver actually the results, and to kind of detect what kind of professions and what kind of the skills will be needed for future. So if we train the workers, with the right skills, we don't need to worry that the companies are not that the companies will be able to build those highly energy efficient and low carbon buildings, because without workers it's impossible to deliver. So what is the strategy? Well, of course, it depends on the sector they represent, and here in the construction, it all depends. You know, there are different strategies among member states, but what we have noticed specifically is the role of the social partnership models. So in some countries, there is very strong relations within the government or within employers. For example, Denmark has very good relations. They are very efficient. They are known. They are really environmental experts, not only known in Europe, but as well internationally. They have excellent relationship with Ministry of Environment. So they don't have a problem, for example, to tackle climate plans or recovery plans, but it's not necessarily the case of other countries in Europe. And as well depends what kind of industrial relations are in place. In some countries you have union already, they have industrial strategy or they try to tackle it. In some countries it's completely non-existent. And of course, there will be some employment gains and some employment losses. For example, in the context of construction, for example, cement, it's, well, it can be, of course, we discuss about sustainable cement, but as well, we talk about high number of workers who are hired in the different cement factories. And of course, they worry if they will remain with their job or not, or what kind of the skills they would require to be able to work in the future in the factory. And the factories, they need to be low carbon emissions. They need to, of course, reduce their emissions. So, well, I could provide, of course, more examples, but I think we still would like to have some kind of debate. So I try to be short and concise, and I thank you very much.
Magdalena, this is hugely appreciated because we have received quite a few questions from the floor, from our audience, and I'll take them in order. Some of them have already been answered and addressed, sometimes by our very speakers. So thank you for that. One question is being asked by Kelly Mullins. And she is asking, I think this is a question that came up during Paolo Tomasetti's presentation. The question is, has anyone considered creating an EU-wide anti-capitalist union that centers its priorities on decarbonization and climate change? And I think it emerges a question in the context of, Paolo, your analysis on the compatibility between the process of production, which is also a process of destruction, as I think you were saying, and the environmental priorities.
Yeah, I mean, turning to the question, as far as I know, the answer is actually no. There is no anti-capitalist movement in trade unions, collective action at the European level, but there are different typologies of collective action promoted by trade unions. More, some of them are more radical than others. Linda mentioned some typologies of trade unions, different actions to protect the environment and to contrast climate change. But I mean, I think, and somehow I hope that the question was provocative. But we really need a deep change, also in how trade unions, organize themselves, and we can see big institutional changes in that direction. For example, many trade unions, confederations. In Italy, in Spain, in France have changed their statutes in order to include also environmental goals within the objectives of their organization. So today is not just defending the collective interest, but there is like an evolution of collective interest towards the protection of more general interests in society that have, let's say, long-term effects then on labor and the decent work and the other objectives that traditionally trade unions have defended.
Thank you very much, Paolo. We will have an opportunity to ask other speakers to comment freely on some of these questions, but let me just, in the meantime, try and address some of the other questions from this very attentive audience that we have. Anna Malinen was saying that, I'm paraphrasing her question, that there is sometimes a bit of a discrepancy. Some of the discussions that take place at the European level or even at the national level when it comes to climate change strategies within the union movement do not necessarily translate in very clear or understandable ways at the local level. I don't think she meant necessarily at the shop floor, but you know, these discussions that we're having now, when they take place at a local level, at a grassroots level, there's always, and I think it was raised by some of you, other priorities that need to be addressed. And I was wondering if you had any comments, especially on successful strategies on how to translate these extremely important elaborations into action at a local level. And I've seen Adrian and Linda raising the finger, so I'll take them in turn. Adrian, please feel free to comment on this. Thank you.
Yes, there's indeed the issue, I think, for many trade unions that they are organized on different levels. You have a national level, you have a sectoral or industry level, you have a company level where unions are organized, and oftentimes unions have difficulties in generating a policy coherence between these different levels of action. So what one often sees on climate change issues is that policy positions that are adopted at the national level are not necessarily followed through at the industry level, where then other logics enter into action, where trade unions or affiliated federations might pursue other priorities. So I think that's indeed a crucial challenge for trade unions. As climate change is a very multidimensional phenomena, they need to be able to get a policy coherence in their climate policies.
Thanks, Adrian. Linda, did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, yes, because I do see the situation changing rather dramatically. I mean, this is the ETUI-ETUC trying to set a completely new agenda. A couple of weeks ago, I attended a meeting of the EFBWW, which was trying to do the same within the construction industry. And it's all very encouraging, that. Plus, we've continued doing our work on trying to identify inspiring examples. You know, we've been visiting sustainable forestry in Sweden, which the union's heavily involved in. And they've also been promoting, as well as just sustainable forestry, the use of wood as an alternative building material. And that's been enormously successful. And at the same time, we've also been visiting Denmark and looked at what they've been doing in terms of the bioeconomy and the involvement of the Union 3F in that. Particularly in lowland south of Copenhagen, where they're producing surplus energy at the moment. So I think you can find that it's always in collaboration, of course. I mean, it's very difficult for unions to, well, you have to work with other bodies. And so I think the importance of coalitions can't be exaggerated.
Nadia, did I sense that you also wanted to share some thoughts on this particular issue? Because I have a question for you later, but in the meantime, let me just try and elaborate a bit on the question that one of our members of our audience, Andreas Brieger, is bringing to the fore. And I think it's also linked to another question that we just received from Manuela Kropp. The question that Andreas is asking is, okay, there's just transitions, but just transitions is, of course, partly about transitioning to a carbon neutral economy. In the process, you know, we're being reassured that we won't have net job losses. In fact, we might even have job gains. But what happens to the individuals? How do their transition take place during the just transition process? Is it the case that somebody that loses a job in industry A finds a job in the new opening industry B? How can we make sure that there is a smooth transition for individual workers? I think it's also linked to Manuela's crops question. She insists on, she queries on the link between climate change acceptance and welfare state models. Is it the case, and I'm paraphrasing Manuela, that there is greater acceptance of the just transition strategies when you have a universalistic welfare state that actually cushions the transition between one job and the other, which is, I think, is the question that Anders Brieger was asking. So who is brave enough, bold enough to try and address these concerns from our audience? Thank you. Please, Linda, yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I specialize in construction, and so that's quite a good industry to think about transition, because there's, I mean, if you look at the, well, in the past, a lot of coal miners went and worked building the Channel Tunnel, but there's a lot of transferability. I mean, this usually depends on a degree of retraining, but you have to look at some of these industries which are being wound down or phased out, and they do employ a lot of people who certainly many can work in the construction area, particularly electricians. So I think we have to always look close on the ground and really do occupational profiles, and then see what's needed in order to transfer into different industries.
Yeah, can I add a comment?
Yes, Paolo, please. Yes.
Yeah, I can bring the example of the electricity sector in Italy and France, which is also another big sector invested by the green transition, energy transition, actually. And here, social partners tried to promote a number of welfare measures coming to the latest question, like, for example, promotion of functional and geographical mobility for workers involved in the restructuring for environmental reasons, using bilateral interprofessional funds to support transitional arrangements and training for green skills. In relation to the anticipation of the social effects of the transition to a low carbon economy, there are also attempts to change job classification systems to make them more respondent to the green jobs labor market. And of course, one good news is that the European Commission just financed a Just Transition Fund in order to support with passive and active labor market policies the negative effects of the energy transition. But unfortunately, the funds are not so huge, and they are focused just on the most critical regions of the European Union. But that's the direction, an intersection between public funds, public policies, and the measures that can be negotiated by such partners through the mature industrial relations systems that promote also transitionary arrangements for workers displaced in the energy reconversion of the economy.
Thank you, Paolo. I think that the question that you've raised about resources is, of course, a key one. I think Nadia has a comment as well. Yes, please, Nadia.
Yeah, I can I can maybe add to this on a little broader level as well, because I think the questions that you just pointed out and that came from our public, they just underlined the importance of trade unions for this transition, because there is a real danger that we now lose the good jobs in the highly regulated sectors, the unionized jobs, and we see a shift into sectors where jobs are rather bad, working conditions are bad, occupational health and safety standards are really low. And that is why we need strong trade unions now that really deal with this transition and try to regulate that. And of course, skills and training are central to this. And this is not only a role of trade unions, public support is needed for this as well. But I really think that unions and the social actors, it's not only unions, it's also employers that are co-responsible, of course, that need to now really deal with this transition, try to regulate that we make sure that even after the transition, we still have good and decent work in Europe.
These are very important considerations, Nadia. I have a couple of other questions, but I remember that after the Brexit referendum, a lot of social scientists, journalists were going around the United Kingdom trying to find out what is it, especially in the north of England, that had generated the Eurosceptic vote to express itself with such a force. And I vividly remember an article journal that said, we used to make the best steel in the world, and we now make lattes. And it had quite an effect on me. And I was wondering whether, you know, we have learned something from those transitions from the industrial to the service economy that can translate into perhaps a more successful just transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy in the present context, without leaving that feeling of being left behind, that resentment that we had in the previous transitions. And transitions and transformations have been part and parcel of our economic system, certainly in the last 200-300 years, in a very accelerated fashion. Are there any thoughts on this question, which in a way links with the question that we got from Damien McElroy? Is it possible to continue to frame just transition within the current economic system, or is it really pushing the boundaries of a current economic system and asking us to look more deeply at a post-capital society? Adrian has some thoughts on this. Yes, Adrian.
Yes, as concerns the just transition concept, I think it's clear that there are many different understandings of a just transition. There's a transformative understanding of just transition as entailing remodeling of the whole economic system, but there's of course also much more down-to-earth conception of just transition as basically entailing retrainment, compensation for lost jobs, and so on. So I think there's a broad spectrum of understandings of just transition. And I think to come back on the point you made, I think that is indeed an important factor in the current approaches to decarbonization, and that's the lived experience of many workers of restructuring, of the history of restructuring, which is often lived as something which is which has negative consequences, which leads to unemployment, or which leads to less good working conditions. And I believe that that's obviously a strong element when people are confronted now with the discussions on decarbonization, because there's this whole lived experience of past restructuring, which has been, which has left bad memories.
Mildly unsuccessful at times. Linda, please. Yes, in fact, I also had a question for you, but I can ask you after.
Well,
I can ask you now, just in case it's something that there's a question that was asked specifically for you by Michael Corcoran, and it was an interesting question. It took me a while to understand what the question was about, but I think I got it now. Should there be a new approach to combining skills, so training, with broader education for the workers that are most affected by the just transition climate change processes? And I think perhaps Magdalena might have some comments on this in order to create, you know, a broader base, but also an understanding of these processes. But you probably wanted to comment on the previous question as well, Linda, in which case, please do.
Well, I think they fit together really, because what I was going to say was that I think, I mean, what is implied in a green transition is a much more qualified workforce. We're not talking about, I mean, also in the care sector, we need a much more qualified workforce. And that places an enormous onus on the education system, and which I don't think it's yet taken really on board. Particularly, I mean, this whole, I talk about vocational education and training, which is a very clumsy term, but that's because we try to bring them together, because there shouldn't be such a thing as training. It has to be educational at the same time. I mean, we're developing a much more abstract type of labor process, and I think we need to really take that on board in every sector.
Magdalena, I was wondering if, as somebody who has a policy competence also in the area of vocational education and training, as we should probably call, you had some thoughts on this, and perhaps some examples from your affiliates, your organizations. We can't hear you, Magdalena. Yes,
I haven't pressed properly the muted, so I muted myself. Well, to tell you with all honesty, of course, we see the lack of right skills, and this is the biggest concern of the construction industry. And as I said at the beginning, it's not only the question of having the right skills for the upcoming jobs in the next decade, but in the first place, having those basic skills, and not only basic skills, but as well how we could, if we know already that we lack a huge amount of workers who could perform, let's call them basic jobs. There is as well this entire question of how we could properly integrate migrant workers, and how we could actually recognize the third country diplomas. I mean, not well, in the first place, diplomas that are already within the EU. You know, we don't need to go that far away. And even in Belgium, between different regions, sometimes because you have the French Wallon diploma, you can't work in Flanders. I mean, we don't need to go that far away. But just to tell you, in the first place, of course, the VET is the national competence. So we, from the European perspective, we can't really involve that much. We can only kind of provide recommendations and try to discuss with members how they could possibly influence, or we see what kind of specific skills they need to perform some kind of jobs. So this is the big challenge, and why I touched the question of migrants is because we know already that within the workforce we have, it's not enough. So we need to think wisely how we could integrate them and propose actually interesting jobs and the career development. It's not only for the European workers, it's for all. And to answer one of the questions that was, I think, online about this prediction on 160,000 jobs, this is the European Commission prediction, which I completely agree, it's underestimated. I don't know from where they have this number. Our predictions, I was just checking numbers while we're having the discussion, is around 1,200,000.
Well, that's it. Right? That's substantial.
Just to give you another numbers, we need to renovate 35 million buildings. How do you want to renovate 35 million buildings with 160,000? This is simple maths. I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to underestimate the European Commission as specialists, right? And we don't want to have only renovations per se. We want to have deep renovations, and we want to have, if I want to include all the public buildings, but I don't want to go to kind of narrow this discussion to the construction itself, but I just wanted to answer the questions that we definitely need to have more green jobs, and we need to have more investment from countries and as well from the companies. companies will need to take care of the training for workers. You know, we have SMEs, they won't be able to provide training for workers. So that needs to be probably handled by big companies, and they need to take it on board. Otherwise, they won't deliver the big construction projects.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. I think the question of the fairness of who's going to carry the burden of the just transition is, these are important redistributive and risk allocation questions. We will not solve them today, but clearly we're in a much stronger and better position to ask the correct questions and think about some of the possible answers as a consequence of this excellent panel. And the excellent questions that we got from the floor. Not all of them have been able to share with us speakers, but we have really reached the end of this interesting panel. Could I please join our audience in thanking all the speakers for their outstanding contribution. I'm sure that they're all applauding the way we would normally do in a normal panel, but I will do it on their behalf. And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Bye.